The internet is absolutely full of falsely attributed quotes, usually pinning a modern proverb on a person of importance, saying that it was originally from Plato or Lincoln or Jefferson, or even some very popular movie stars. I can't object too much, since that's basically the way the New Testament Gospels were written. I mean, really, much to the chagrin of many church-going folks, scholars are generally in agreement that very few of the sayings attributed to Jesus, maybe 8 of the gospel statements, maybe 8 have some historical tie to Jesus, but probably only 1 or 2. But the name and image of Jesus gained popularity in the late first century, and people tended to give Jesus credit for coming up with whatever pithy parable or saying that was worthy of making a meme of in whatever mediums they used in the first century. One of our most popular sages in the present moment is Dr. Anthony Fauci. This quote, "I don't know how to explain to you that you should care about other people," has been broadly attributed to him lately because the shoe fits. I mean, you can imagine him saying that. We keep trying to convince people to wear masks, to avoid travel, not to share air with other people in confined spaces. And we've been saying these things for so many months that when you see people in public who are ignoring these rules, it really can't be because they haven't heard them. And it's unlikely that many people find the reasons and methods difficult to comprehend. What we are seeing more sadly is a whole lot of people who just don't care. And at that point, we tend to run out of words. How can I explain to you that you ought to care about the health and well-being of the other people here at the grocery store if you don't already care? And I wouldn't make such an issue of the fact that this quote was mistakenly attached to Dr. Fauci, except that I think it's important to note that this issue of human selfishness is not just a pandemic issue. It was around a long time before we heard of COVID-19. The pandemic makes it easier to walk through the grocery store and see who does care about others and who doesn't. But this particular quote isn't even related to COVID-19. The quote originates with an author of young adult books, someone that, frankly, you're not likely to have heard of, Lauren Morrill. She uttered these words in exasperation when in the format where we get most of our philosophy these days, right off of Twitter. In 2017, just before Donald Trump was inaugurated, he announced his intention to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And Morrill was about to deliver her second child, and she was very concerned about losing health care. Exasperated by the renewed fear of being uninsured with a young family, she tweeted that her whole problem with the whole universal health care debate is that she didn't know how to explain to people that they ought to care about other people. That so many Americans are willing to say, "I've got mine, so don't change the system," knowing that maintaining the status quo leaves millions of poorer and sicker Americans without health care. Well, that's just disturbing. I have never been able to understand why the relatively unchurched nations of Western Europe seem to be able to think about public policy with the poor and the vulnerable in mind, while Americans, far too often, with a church on every corner, just don't seem to get it. It might lead you to believe that in spite of all of our churches, that we are not good people, that there is something morally wrong with us. But I do have this caveat. I think that Americans still have an innate impulse for compassion. In May of 2011, a tornado ripped through Joplin, Missouri, just 70 miles from here, and it was the most powerful tornado in recorded history. Leveled houses and businesses, nearly leveled a hospital even, in a mile-wide, 7-mile-long swath. 158 people we assume were killed. We never found the bodies of lots of them. Thousands of people were injured. There was nearly $3 billion in damages. Now, there may have been looters in Joplin somewhere, but I didn't see any of that going on. What I did see were thousands of people coming from all over Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas. So many volunteers, and the United Way tried to take charge and organize all the volunteers, and they couldn't do it. They simply couldn't register and assign people. So most of us ended up just getting back into our trucks with our gloves and our gear, and we just wandered into the neighborhoods that were lining where the tornado had taken away everything but the grass, and we just started picking up broken glass and shingles, insulation, slowly bagging up the destroyed remnants of thousands of people's lives. No one paid us to do it. What's more, no one asked us to do it. We saw what had happened in the news, and the next day, thousands of people were showing up to help. I think that's an innate instinct in conservatives and in liberals. I think it's part of what it means to be a Republican or a Democrat. The problem is when we have too much time to think about it, isn't it? But when we react on impulse, I believe our impulse is still towards compassion. My longtime scuba buddy, Dr. Bill Ringo, has actually gone to Nicaragua with me to help build houses. But Bill is a scientist, and he specializes in environmental toxins. And so when Katrina hit in 2005, FEMA tapped my friend Bill to coordinate the work of recovery in the entire state of Mississippi, which had a long coast that was also dramatically affected. My church wanted to send teams of volunteers, but my good friend Bill Ringo said, this is too big and it is too dangerous for untrained volunteers. As always, I'm always willing to follow the advice of scientists, but in fact, it was our own Mark Rowland who replied to my news from Bill saying, well, I'm going to go. And it took me about 5 seconds to say, well, you're not going to go without me. So we started sending teams to the coast. And over the next year, we made 8 trips in a bus loaded with uncompensated volunteers, equipped with chainsaws, wheelbarrows, and wrecking bars. We slept on the floors of churches and in tents. I think, Rob, we stayed in a drug rehab center that was not operating as a drug rehab center at the time. And we kept moving farther into the city of New Orleans. As the water receded, we were clearing roads, covering roofs with blue tarps, and gutting flooded houses to get them ready to be rebuilt. All volunteers responding to a massive humanitarian crisis. And at the end of that year, my friend Bill said to me, thank God for the churches that came to the coast. They actually accomplished miracles while FEMA was still trying to get organized. I don't say that to knock FEMA. FEMA had a bigger job to do, and they did eventually do a lot of important work that churches couldn't have done. I'm just saying that well-intended, good people can make a huge difference by simply following their impulse to be good people. I think that one of the differences between America's response to Katrina and the Joplin tornado and this political battle that we're having about health care is that when a crisis strikes, before you have time to think about it, before you have time to debate it, before politicians divide up and take sides, you're already on a church bus loaded with equipment and other volunteers on your way to be helpful. On many public policy issues, it just isn't an immediate crisis. Note how slowly poverty moves. Note how slowly even the pandemic has been. it was announced in our area in March, it was frightening to many of us immediately, but really the problems were mostly in New York and on the East Coast. But others found it to be a political badge of honor to insist that it wasn't even real. We had the luxury of debating it for months before it got to be a hazard in our own area. And even though we're experiencing more than a dozen deaths a day in our relatively small community and hundreds of new infections, our hospitals are full, our ICU units are at capacity. We still have a few people around here saying that it isn't real. I know a couple of people who are insisting that it isn't real, and I have seen these same people be extremely compassionate about other issues in the past. Something has gone wrong in this scenario. Somehow we have allowed a narcissistic strain, a selfish, fearful, self-protective strain of thinking to enter our minds and to literally poison our hearts, because I think our hearts are good. I think our impulses, our instincts are good. But 6 months ago when we were first recording services, I sneezed. I started to sneeze into my hand. I got confused, turned and sneezed into my elbow, threw myself off balance, and fell into the drum set just off the chancel. It was the noisiest fall in human history. And people who don't even like me were yelling, "Call 911." I wasn't hurt, but it sounded like I might have broken every bone in my body. But your instincts don't wait for you to pass judgment. We may build an elaborate defense against universal health care, but if someone falls off a ladder right in front of you, you don't wait to see if they've got insurance. You don't wonder about whether they are a good employee, or if they keep their yard up well, or if they wash their car. You run to their side to give them aid. Now that's the part of our public in America that I want to draw out into the light, that instinct to act. In Republicans and in Democrats, in liberals and conservatives, I suggest that all of us try to find that instinctive good person and put that person in charge of our lives. If you'll indulge me to talk about Jesus for a few minutes, I know you don't really expect it of me anymore, but if you will allow me to revisit my college teaching days, in the good old days when a course on the life and teachings of Jesus was a part of the core curriculum at Drury University, I usually taught a section every semester of life and teachings. You start with a couple of dozen Midwestern teenagers who, when you ask them who Jesus was, they'll give you a pretty creedal response. Jesus was the Son of God who died on the cross for our salvation, and he's now seated at the right hand of God in heaven awaiting a final judgment. So as much as it's possible to set these notions aside, I would ask my students to begin to read the Gospels, and I ask them to write a job description for the Messiah. Based on what Jesus said and did, who was he really? Who was he really about? What was he really about? And we read the Gospels in the order that we believe that they were written in, starting with Mark, and then Luke, and then Matthew, and then John. The first supernatural thing that Jesus does in Mark is a demon exorcism. So when you start to write your job description for the Messiah, the first thing you write down is demon exorcist. That's not where anybody wanted to start, but that's where Mark starts. It's right there in Mark 1. Only made all the more uncomfortable by the fact that Jesus encountered this demon-possessed man when he went to church. And haven't we all been there? The next thing he did was to heal Peter's mother-in-law. Word got out. A whole crowd of people heard that Jesus was a healer. They came to that house to be healed. And when he finished with the exorcism and the healing, he tells his disciples that he has to go preach. So he's an exorcist, he's a healer, and he's a preacher. He ends up healing several people along the way. He's going to preach, and he's always healing people who had become outcasts because of their illnesses. Lepers, couldn't live among decent folk. They had to live outside the village. They were excluded. So Jesus begins to incorporate curious dimensions into the healings. He tells a paralytic, your sins are forgiven, rather than you are healed, which is what you might expect, right? And that sort of upsets the neighbors. Who, after all, has the authority to forgive sins besides? What sins are you talking about? What did he do that we don't know? Who are you to judge such things? I don't want to drag you through the whole semester. I kind of do, but I'm not going to drag you through the whole semester. What emerges from the process of going to the text to find out something about Jesus is that he is primarily a healer and a reconciler. That is, his message is tied to the healing events. The healing events are sort of supernatural sermon illustrations. He forgives and restores both prostitutes as well as self-righteous religious people. He shows mercy and generosity to the undeserving. He helps people who cannot help him. Even demon exorcism, if you read that as a kind of mental illness, that these are people who have been fractured in their relationships from society, from their family. Everything about Jesus is somehow pulling people back together. I am deeply indebted to the work of the late Marcus Borg, who published this book in 1994, right when I needed it because I was just starting to teach in those years. I used the book in my classes for several years because I believe Borg distilled the issue perfectly. Once you give up on the creedal Jesus, when you try to understand who Jesus actually was in the first century, I don't think anyone captured it as well as Marcus Borg, who called Jesus a teacher of radical compassion. Think of the stories he told. What's the point of the parable of the prodigal son? Really a story about a father who showed boundless mercy to a unarguably poorly behaving and self-centered son. And that business of a shepherd leaving 99 sheep unprotected to go out to find the one that was lost, the one that was in danger, the one that needed to be brought back into the fold. Even the story of the Good Samaritan, the one person who actually stopped to put the clumsy preacher from the drum set over the back of his burro to get him help, he gets him to an end and he tells the innkeeper, spare no expense. Take care of this guy, and when I come back through here, I will repay you whatever you spent on him. Compassion without boundaries, without limits. So radical that you can say, whatever it takes. I'm in for a penny, I'm in for a pound. Before later generations attached a lot of religious stuff to Jesus, the way that social media gives Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln credit for modern proverbs, before Jesus became a get-out-of-hell-free token, Jesus was a teacher of radical compassion. He touched lepers, people that no one else would touch for $1 million. The demon-possessed, probably the mentally ill, were social rejects. He healed them and allowed them to go home. He publicly dined with sinners and prostitutes, the people that the self-righteous only visited under the cover of darkness. I keep searching for ways to pull the divided people of America back together again. Where can conservatives and liberals meet on common ground? What shared experience, what shared values and beliefs might we have that would allow us to start singing off the same page of the hymnal again? I am modestly proposing that we try to consider our mutual respect and value and admiration for the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Could we stop fighting for power and recognition just long enough to remember the faith that most of us shared at some time in our lives before we got distracted by 24/7 political bickering, and figure out who we hated and whose rights we were willing to bargain away, that we could justify in our own minds, that we don't have to provide health care to this kind of person or job protection to these kinds of people. Remember when Jesus meant something to us? That if you could be convinced that if Jesus said it, you needed to take it seriously? Not in a stained glass sort of way, but more in the becoming the kind of person that'll smuggle decent food into a hospital room for someone who's had nothing but mystery meat and green beans for too many days in a row. The Jesus who goes to court with you and sits beside you while the prosecutor explains to the judge that you are a worthless human being, a scourge on society, and that you should be in prison forever. The Jesus who then pats that person's hand, looks him in the eyes and says, well, I love you. I don't want to shame people who fight against a stimulus bill for pandemic victims, or bring up the whole matter of children kept in cages that we can't even find the paperwork to find out what we did with their parents. I just want to invite you to meet me where a teacher of radical compassion will spread out his arms, even if he ends up getting his hands nailed to a cross, to say that no one is disposable. No one is undeserving. No one has to earn forgiveness, acceptance. No one has to earn a seat at the table. We may disagree about how to get there, but we can at least agree that Jesus was trying to teach us to practice radical compassion. And shouldn't that be something that conservatives and liberals both value? I can't believe that I'm saying this, but seriously, conservatives and liberals, isn't it time for us all to go back to church and pay attention to what Jesus was saying? Now, back in the summer, Paul Krugman, who looks a lot like Jesus, wrote an opinion piece that I saw in the New York Times, and the title of it was "A Cult of Selfishness That is Killing America." The pandemic divided Americans like everything else between conservatives and liberals, but even though conservatives were largely saying that keeping the economy going was more important than slowing the spread of a virus that 99% of us will survive anyway. But conservatives didn't just hurt themselves. The lack of being willing to work together has hurt all of us. It isn't just that Krugman notes that Americans are 15 times more likely to die of COVID than our European and Canadian counterparts. And while the ignorant and incompetent Trump administration's management of the pandemic is a significant factor, Krugman continues, it is more than that. He says, they were all members of America's cult of selfishness. Look at the intensity of the opposition we see to having to use water-saving shower heads, or more energy-efficient light bulbs, or even removing phosphates from laundry soap. And Trump will gin up anger at his rallies, talking about you can't even get clean because the shower head's not letting enough water out. Your dishes don't get clean in the dishwasher because you can't put phosphates in the soap anymore. And the lighting is always terrible because you have to use these energy efficient bulbs. These are all things that are intended to safeguard the environment. And a healthy environment is good for everyone, not even just people. It's good for fish and frogs and horses and eagles. But these benefits come at the price of a very minor personal sacrifice or adjustment, and people often react with irrational ferocity to even these, I don't know, are these microaggressions, that you have to deal with limited water flow and stuff. Krugman concludes his piece saying, what the coronavirus has revealed is the power of America's cult of selfishness, and this cult is killing us. What makes teaching radical compassion so necessary is this hatred that many Americans have for being told that we as individuals owe a debt of responsibility for the well-being of the public as a whole. And if Jesus' parables, sermons, conversations, and even his miracles were all teaching radical compassion, then it stands to reason that radical compassion can be taught. Children can be raised to be compassionate, and adults can be changed so that even we old graybeards can learn to be better at being compassionate. I believe it because, as I've pointed out earlier, compassion is still our innate gut-level response. We automatically choose compassion until something stops us from doing so, some fear or prejudice. We have to be taught to suppress our innate kindness. We can be taught to restore it. We're all in this together. We are all connected. In a pandemic, we are more connected than at any other time in our lives. We are sharing air with everyone we walk into a grocery store with every kid working at a drive-through window at McDonald's, and every janitor, nurse's aide, RN, and physician that we see when we're in a clinic or a hospital. Their health, at least to some degree, depends on me, and that fact should not make us angry. It shouldn't make us feel that we're losing some of our freedom or our independence. It is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to show compassion by being responsible. It gives us an opportunity to be a better person. Regardless of political affiliation, don't we all want to be good people? And in a democracy where we are free to choose to be anything we want to be, wouldn't it be great if we just chose to be kind?
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.